Alrighty, welcome in everyone to another edition of Just Another College Football Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Wednesday, May 14th, and we have quite a bit to get to. A lot of stuff broke right after the show last week, but we have time to get to it officially today. We're going to start talking about the 16-team playoff. That is something that has started to gain traction around the SEC and the Big Ten camps. Something we're going to want to talk about, get into a little bit, because it has big-time implications for what the future of college football will look like, and there's pros, there's a couple more cons, but we'll get into all of that in the first segment. Then we'll talk a little bit about some of the different things happening around the sports commission that was set up by Donald Trump not too long ago. Nick Saban is going to be the co-chair. Cody Campbell will be joining him as a co-chair as well, and we'll get into him and kind of his story in that segment. Then we'll get to all the other news that has kind of come off across the week with a couple of different interesting things to get across on y'all's brains. And then we'll finish it off. We'll do a little of my post-spring top 25. I did my top 10 last week. If you want to go check out that video, please do. But also going to do 11 through 25 today. And very, very hard to put together a couple of teams that were left off that I don't feel great about. But at the end of the day, there's a number of different things there that I think it's really fun to break down as we get to the end of spring practice. But let's go ahead and jump into this. Let's jump into the 16-team playoff because it is a big deal. It is the next kind of iteration of what the playoff is going to look like. At least that's what it sounds like. I think all of us understand that going into the 2026 season, we're very likely going to have a different format for the playoff, whether that's going to be a more expansive, 14 team or a 16 team playoff, or it's going to be something entirely different where they just keep it at 12 teams but kind of play around with how the seeding works. Maybe those conference champions don't get the buys that they have gotten. Maybe that will go into place this year. There's a lot of moving parts around this, but in terms of the 16 team playoff, in terms of what could happen in 2026, let's jump into this really quickly. And I think the biggest thing to remember here is there's a lot of power in the SEC and Big Ten's hands. Whether we want it to be that way or not, that is the world that we live in right now in the college sports, and that's the way this is going to unfold. So for the 16-team playoff, the way it will be currently formatted, or at least the way the format that is gaining the most traction, at least as of right now in these discussions, is the SEC and the Big Ten would get 4 auto bids each, so they would take up at the very least half of the entire field for the 16-team playoff. Then you would get 2 each for the ACC and the Big 12, so whoever went to the championship games for those two conferences, they're automatically in. Iowa State would have been in this past year from the Big 12, not just Arizona State. And then one group of 5 auto bid for whoever is the top group of 5 team. Was Boise State this year, would be someone else, and that's not a change from the 12 team. And then 3 at-large bids, and you have to imagine that those three would probably be taken up by the SEC and the Big Ten, and obviously that is everyone's biggest beef. The SEC and the Big Ten being able to get 4 auto bids each and not necessarily have to worry too much about what's going on around them, what's going on in the ACC and the Big 12. They focus on what's going on in their conference, and we'll talk about that here in a second, but that is a very, very interesting concept, and it is something that makes people very frustrated, and I totally understand that approach. Not saying that those people are wrong by any means. What I will say is if you were going to get to a 16-team playoff, I mean, we just saw a 12-team, and you had, I believe, 3 SEC teams in there with Tennessee, Texas, and Georgia, and you had 4 Big Ten teams with Penn State, Ohio State, Indiana, as well as Oregon. So you already kind of got close, if we're being totally honest. You got very close to this possibly happening. Alabama almost jumped SMU and got in as well. That would have been 8 teams from the SEC and the Big Ten in that thing. So just to keep that in mind, it almost already happened with the 12-team playoff if we went to 16 teams. And I know a lot of people kind of advocate for the idea of all at-large bids, just no auto bids at all, and that's something that I used to be very much in favor of, and I would be very much in favor of in a smaller playoff format. But I think when you get to the 16-team playoff format, I think you're going to realize that the ACC getting 2, the Big 12 getting 2, the Group of 5 even getting 1 might be a little bit more generous. If we go to the at-large bids, I don't think there's anything stopping these people from putting 12 SEC and Big 10 teams in, 14 of teams from those two conferences into this thing if there's no guardrails, and if we're measuring strength of schedule the right way. There's a real reality where at-large bids could actually lead to more SEC and Big Ten teams being in this dance than would be in this current format. So it's not my favorite format. I want to make that very, very clear. If I had the ball in my hands, I would go backwards quite a bit, maybe even back to the 4-team playoff, probably back to an 8-team. I think that's kind of the right number right about now. I used to be in favor of 6, but don't necessarily love the bye system given how much college football has changed and how somewhat the scales are evening. Very much want it to be kind of a straightforward, no one gets a bye type of approach. So I would be at 8 teams, and I'd probably do all at large bids and go from there and rank strength of schedule the right way and do it that way. But the reality is we're down this road and we're not going backwards. So it looks like 16 teams is gaining a lot of traction. 14 is still very much on the table, but regardless, the SEC and the Big Ten are going to hold a lot of power here. They're going to get a lot of auto bids. They're going to get more auto bids than just about everyone else, and that's just kind of the reality. No matter how you cut this thing, there will be more SEC and Big Ten teams in this every single year than every other conference. I can promise you that. But this does add an interesting question because you got four auto bids for the SEC and the Big Ten, and you have to figure out how those teams get in. Who are the 4 teams? Is it just the top 4? Well, it sounds like there's going to be some implications on championship weekend that might not be around the top 2 teams. It could very well be that the top 2 teams just don't play that weekend. That's kind of their reward for being the top 2 teams in the conference. They get to roll off, get their week off, maybe even 2 weeks off, depending on the formatting of the playoff, and then you get to move into the playoff fully healthy. We've seen that rest versus rust is a big kind of debate, and we can talk about that as this kind of gets a little bit further down the road, but it would be a 3rd place versus 6th place and a 4th place versus 5th place matchup in both those conferences. So I believe this year the 3rd place in the SEC was Tennessee. I believe Tennessee was there, and then Ole Miss was at 6, if I'm not mistaken. Could have been someone different. Apologies if so. But regardless, it would be those type of matchups. So Tennessee against Ole Miss, let's say, or Alabama against LSU, or something like that for those final 2 spots. Up in the Big Ten, you could have Indiana against Illinois, or Penn State against, Wisconsin, whoever it is, ends up being that 3rd or 6th team or that 4th or 5th team, they'll end up playing for those other 2 spots. So the top 2 teams, they are in, no problem, could play a conference championship, could not. I would love to see them play a conference championship, but understand that that's kind of a bygone thought, so we'll see what happens there, but it does sound like there will be play-in games for this, and it'd be really interesting to see how that would unfold and would add more games to conference championship weekend. Maybe not the games that we want to see, but definitely more games, and would be very, very interesting to watch. So that's what you have. You have 4 auto bids for the SEC and the Big Ten with play-in games for those 3rd through 6th seeds. They play play-in games to get those final 2 spots. The ACC and the Big 12 is pretty straightforward. Whoever makes the conference championship will make the CFP. Will they play that game to figure out seeding is a whole other conversation. The group of 5 teams, and then the at-large bids, you can bet they're going to be losers from these play-in games from the SEC and the Big Ten. At least I would bet that pretty comfortably. But now we know the format. Now we know how this is going to break down. There are some things I don't love about it. There's some things that I think are actually relative pros. And let's go ahead and get into the pros right now, and then we'll get into the darker side of this here in a second. But for the pros, the one thing that I absolutely love, and something that I kind of overlooked until I listened to Josh Pate talk about this, was this will give importance to the conference races. One way or another, you are going to have to worry about where you sit in your conference, not just where you sit in the CFP poll. And I think that's kind of a big beef around the CFP format that we have right now, where it just doesn't feel like these conference games hold as much weight as you would like them to. It doesn't feel like they hold any more weight than the out-of-conference game you played in week 2 or the rivalry game you play out of conference in the last week of the season. Just doesn't feel like these games matter as much as they probably should. This would put more emphasis on that one way or another. If you get to the end of the year and you have, let's say, 3 or 4 teams in the SEC that are 9-3, and they're all hanging out between 3 and 7, that's going to be a really, really hard fight to the very, very last weekend to figure out who gets 3 versus 4, who gets 4 versus 5, and we'll see what happens there. So it's going to be one of those things where we have a position where, yes, we are losing a little bit of, we're losing those at-large bids. We're giving a lot of power to the SEC to be able to do whatever they please and kind of get 4 teams in no matter what. We're also putting a little bit more emphasis on these conference games, on these conference races. Obviously, the Big 12 and the ACC were already pretty intense because they understood they pretty much had to win the conference or at least be very close to get in. But the reality is, it will add a little bit of juice to some of those SEC games that this past year, just being totally honest, didn't have much juice at all. There were a lot of SEC games that you're looking at and you're saying, whether they win or lose, especially early in the season, doesn't make much of a difference. It very well could now. So I do really like that aspect of it. You're putting a lot of emphasis on conference races and playing your guys as hard as you possibly can in those conference games, and I think that's a big time pro. We'll get to the con that goes with that here in a second, but another pro here is you will never have an undeserving champion ever again. I can promise you that. And I really don't think that existed before, if I'm being totally honest. I don't necessarily think that was a thing that really was running rampant in the sport, that we had undeserving champions, quote unquote. But the reality is, we saw what Ohio State just did. And in a lot of other years, if they had lost to Michigan, but then somehow gotten into the 14 field and gotten hot for 2 games, some people would have discredited it. Some people would have said, they were just hot at the right time. They weren't actually the best team in the country, but they were very deserving champions because they walked through Tennessee, Oregon, Texas, and then Notre Dame to win that national championship. So regardless of being 10-2, regardless of not playing their best football and maybe not being an overly deserving team at the very end of the year to win the national title, at least end of the regular season, they then became a very deserving champion. As they went through the 12 team, would be the exact same thing with the 16 team. You have to beat those elite teams somewhere along the way, even if you're a Boise State somehow and you find your way into the dance after playing a cupcake schedule. If you find a way to win 4 games against elite teams, you're a very deserving champion. So that's the other part of it that I don't think was necessarily running rampant in the sport before. I don't think it was a crazy, crazy thing, but you go back to the BCS days and there were definitely some controversial picks for who's that second team in that championship, and sometimes you do have that kind of that debate at the end of the year. Was that the best team in the country, or was that just the team that was in the right spot at the right time? That will no longer be the case. It's just about, can you beat elite teams week over week, and that's exactly what Ohio State did. Definitely going to have to do it in the 16-team era. So I think that's another pro. And then finally, a pro that makes me kind of upset. I'll be totally honest with you, but it is a pro nonetheless. The SEC and the Big Ten might stick around with the rest of the sport, and that's a big deal, one way or another. It's not something that I think a lot of us love, the idea that the SEC and the Big Ten every couple of years just get to hold the sport kind of hostage as they get what they want, and then we can move forward as a sport once they do. That's a frustrating model, and I fully agree with that, and we'll talk about the commission here in a second and see how that could possibly fix some of the issues with that. But the reality is, right now, you want to keep this sport intact. You want to make sure that there isn't a world where in 5 years the SEC and the Big Ten go off and start their own football entity and kind of break off from everyone else. And with that, cause huge, huge problems in the world of college football, not in the world of the SEC or the Big Ten, but in the world of everyone else. Would definitely cause a ton of problems, and that's something that you have to avoid, at least in the short term, as we try to figure out what the new structure of college football is going to be, who the governing body is going to be, and all of that different type of stuff. The goal is to keep these 2 guys here, and that's a very, very difficult thing to do. This is something that might just be a necessary evil, I guess is the best way to put it, is giving these teams a little bit more leeway, a little bit more of a bump, because you need them in this sport if you're going to keep afloat for the next little bit. The cons, which are a little bit more plentiful and a little bit more serious in my estimation, the biggest one is more non-CFP level teams will make the CFP. That's just the reality. I think we saw it last year, not to throw shade at Michigan, and they obviously didn't make it last year, but just to say, if a Michigan team that goes 8-4 in a not so strong Big Ten, let's just say, they find a way to go 8-4, they end fourth in the conference, they find a way into the dance. Or I guess they would play that play-in game, but they would still have the ability to find their way into the playoff, even as an at-large team at the end of the day. So that's not a CFP level team. I have always believed that it should be a remarkably exclusive club to get into the CFP, and it should be really, really hard to win a national title. You should have to be near perfect to win a national title. Now, Ohio State kind of debunked that theory a little bit, but I do think there's a reality where you're allowing teams that just don't really belong in a CFP type setting into the CFP, and you're creating some problems there. You're really just giving them another chance to cash a check, and that's something we'll talk about here in a second, because that's my biggest beef with this. But another huge beef I have is, Out-of-conference schedules will be ruined by this. I can absolutely promise you that. Now, you might have some G5 teams that keep trying to schedule up to get one of those big marquee wins or at least help themselves in the strength of schedule department to try to edge out maybe another group of 5 team. But when you look at games coming up, we have Ohio State, Texas to kick off the year, which we'll talk about that in the next segment. But the reality of the matter is, if this was put into place 3 years ago, they would have canceled those games. I know we have, I believe, Notre Dame's playing a series against, I'm blanking on the team right about now. I believe they're playing Alabama in a series coming up over the next couple of years. I know they just scheduled one with Clemson for 12 years going forward from 2027 all the way to 2038. I can almost assure you that if this is put into place, both those teams will say, why are we doing this? Why are we putting ourselves in this position? Maybe Notre Dame's a little bit different because they're only eligible for those at-large bids, but the reality of the matter is, what would be the benefit for Clemson to play that Notre Dame game, possibly have some guys get more dinged up than they normally would, and then go into conference play a little bit worse than you normally would if you were able to play a Charleston Southern? So that's the other reality of this. If you put so much emphasis on the conference races, which should be the emphasis of the sport, I fully agree with that, but you are going to lose the out-of-conference games, or at least some of them. Maybe some teams are still going to be more than willing to schedule tough, and that has a little bit more to do with the committee than anything else, being able to weigh, strength of schedule the right way to prioritize these teams and incentivize these teams to schedule really hard games. But at the end of the day, doesn't seem like they're doing that right now. And if I was Texas, if I was Ohio State, and I had big-time games scheduled in the future, but I knew they weren't going to have a bearing on what I did in the CFP or my positioning in the CFP, I'd probably cancel those games and just make sure that I'm ready, make sure I'm playing my best football, and make sure I'm fully healthy going into those conference games. So that is a big drawback. The season would essentially start around week 4 when those conference games started, and I don't think any of us want that either. And then the biggest one to me is they can keep selling the big CFP lie. The lie that has been told time and time again as we talk about the CFP, the lie that just goes essentially like the more teams that are in the CFP, the more teams have a chance to win the national title. That is not the case. Let's just be totally honest with each other. Boise State was not walking into that Fiesta Bowl, beating Penn State, then walking right over to the Cotton Bowl, beating Notre Dame, and then finding a way to beat Ohio State in the national title. They did not have a shot to win the national title. They were only 3 wins away from it. Those 3 wins were going to be impossible for Boise State to get. It didn't matter that they were in the CFP. It didn't matter that they were in the dance. They got another chance to play a game. They got another chance to cash a paycheck and then move on forward. And that's not necessarily to say they didn't belong. It's not to say that they don't belong going forward in these in the CFP, in these matchups. But the reality of the matter is, adding more teams to the CFP does not give more teams the ability to win the national title. What it does is give more teams the ability to play one more game. You get to play one more game where you go on the road and get absolutely buried. That's the reality of this situation. So I understand, the idea of a Boise State winning a national title is awesome. The idea of an Arizona State coming out of nowhere last year and being able to get to the promised land is incredible. It's not going to happen. Just plain and simple. These teams that are getting in from certain conferences, or these teams that are getting in at large, they don't necessarily have the resources, the ability, the guys to win a national title. So that's the reality. The same amount of teams are going to be able to win a national title right now as they're going to be able to win it in the 16-team playoff, as they're going to be able to win it in the 24-team playoff. The reality is more teams just get a chance to say, I was a CFP team this year, which is all well and good, just doesn't enhance the sport all that much. It doesn't change the sport by any means. It just creates kind of this mess at the end of the year where you look at the CFP bracket and say, does that team really belong here? Does that team really have a shot to win the national title? And for the vast majority of those teams in the 16-team playoff, the answer is going to be no. So I absolutely hate that. I think it's ridiculous. I think it's the idea of you get to go to the big boy table, you get to sit at the parents' table at Thanksgiving, but your seat is very, very low. You barely see over the table. You don't get to get a word in edgewise. You're not actually at the table. You just get to feel like you're at the table. So it's one of those things that I fully understand why people want more teams in it. I fully understand why they want other teams to have a shot to win the national title. The reality of the matter is, adding more teams to this thing will not give more teams the ability to win the national title. it will give them the hope that they possibly could. And that's the only reality there. So it's a back and forth thing. And I think the reality is, and I think with a lot of people, the reality is the cons far outweigh the pros, at least in my personal opinion. The other thing to remember in all of this, when you're talking about conference expansion, when you're talking about CFP expansion, when you're talking about all of the changes in college sports, the SEC and the Big Ten are going to win. Plain and simple. They are going to win this battle one way or another, whether it's moving to a 16-team playoff and getting 4 auto bids, whether it's moving to a 14-team and getting 3 auto bids each, whether it's breaking off and being their entire separate entity all by itself. They are going to win this battle. You have to find a way to keep them intact for the time being and then put in a 16-team playoff that sort of makes sense. I don't love a 16-team playoff. If it were up to me, we'd probably go back to 8 teams and we'd start working in all at-large bids. We'd probably play around with a group of 5 playoff. I'd make a lot of changes. So the reality of the matter is I hate CFP expansion. I hate it when it happened first. I hate it now. It's something that I wish we could go back on and make right. That's not going to happen. So the best thing we can do right now is just make the best out of a bad situation. Hopefully, they set this thing up to where we still can have great out-of-conference games, and those can be weighted the way that they should be for those at-large teams. We can still have intense SEC and Big Ten championship games because they will matter in the CFP race. Hopefully, we can have all of these things. I think the reality is some of those things are going to go by the wayside, and it's not something that I want to see happen. It's also something that I understand that we're probably not going to be able to be fighting for very much longer. So it's a battle back and forth. And I think there's a lot of people that will say it's a great idea because look at the ratings that it'll bring, look at all the people that will watch, look at the teams that will have a shot to win the national title. Maybe I'm a little bit too pessimistic, but I don't think it changes the amount of teams that have a chance to win the national title. I think it just changes the amount of teams that get to have that CFP patch on their jerseys in December. So I don't necessarily throw, tires at you if you are fully in favor of the 16 team. I'm just not. I don't get it. I don't think it's necessary. I think it's way more necessary to go backwards than forwards. We're not getting that from this group of people. They want a little bit more money in their pockets, and they're going to do whatever they can to get that. So that's the reality of where we're sitting right now. The SEC and the Big Ten are holding all the power. They're starting to lean towards the 16-team playoff. You can probably imagine that that's where we're going to end up. So it'll be an interesting thing to watch. We'll talk about it more. Their CFP changes could come as early as this year. I don't think it's going to go to 16 teams this year, but very well could change up just a little bit this year, and we'll get into it when it does. We'll talk about it all as it unfolds, but let's take our first break here. Went a little bit long-winded, but was quite upset when that news came out. But the reality is, let's take a little bit of a break here, and when we come back, we'll get into the NCAA Sports Commission that was set up by Donald Trump. We'll get into the details of that, how it's going to unfold, and the co-chairs of that, and how it's a very, very interesting duo that they have. But we'll talk about it all right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about that 16-team playoff that's gaining a little bit of traction in the SEC and the Big Ten offices. I don't love it. I'll be totally honest with you. Wish we could go backwards. We're not going to go backwards. So the hope is that when we get to a 16-team playoff, and it is when, not if, I can promise you that, when we get to that number, hopefully it's set up as well as it possibly can be. And I think they have an okay idea, at least as of right now. We'll get into more details as it gets a little bit further down the road, but right now, not in favor, but going to be along for the ride, and we'll just see if we land in at least an acceptable position there. But let's get into the Sports Commission, because it is a massive, massive deal, and just a little bit of a overview for a headline that is a little bit old right now, so maybe you've forgotten about it, or maybe you didn't even know that this was happening in the first place. But details are essentially this. President Trump went down to Tuscaloosa, Alabama to do a speech at one of the commencement hearings for the Crimson Tide about 2 weeks ago, and met with Nick Saban while he was down there. In the time since, he has set up what's called an NCAA Sports Commission. At least that's the way that that's the way it's being dubbed. And he is tabbed Nick Saban as a co-chair for that commission. The other co-chair will be Cody Campbell, and that's a very interesting figure that we'll talk about here in a second. But I want to get into Nick Saban here for a second. I understand. There are a lot of people that don't love Nick Saban. I understand it's for a number of different reasons. I am a Georgia fan. I went to Georgia. I fully understand that there are a lot of Georgia fans that will never like this man. The other reality here is he fully understands what's going on in the sport. He fully understands how hard this is on coaches and how us losing a lot of the great coaches we have over the last couple of years has hurt this sport in a lot of different ways. That is a piece of this. I fully understand that so much of the energy is going to be put towards players' rights, and it very much should. That should be where the conversation is. But the reality of the matter is, very few people on planet Earth understand every single side of this issue more than Nick Saban, and understand the pitfalls for the players, understand the pitfalls for the coaches, understand the pitfalls for just the sport as a whole. And there's very few people that care about the players, the sport, and the coaches as much as Nick Saban does. That's just the reality of the situation. I understand people are super upset, saying he wants to just send it back to the days where Alabama was dominating. He's not trying to do that, I promise you, because Alabama, they can dominate in this era. I can promise you that. It is not this era that is holding Alabama back. It is a number of other things, and Nick Saban just wants what's best for the sport. I firmly believe that. Maybe I'll have egg on my face in a couple of weeks, but I'm more than fine to trust Nick Saban with the future of the sport. The person that will be going with him is Cody Campbell, and a very interesting figure. Played football at Texas Tech back in the day and has since become a mega donor and a board chair for Texas Tech. He is a huge reason why Texas Tech is a big deal going into this year, and we'll get to talk about them in the next segment. But the reality is a very, very prominent figure kind of behind the scenes in the sport. You might have not heard this name before he popped up around this kind of project, but a very, very pivotal figure, a guy that absolutely has spoken a lot about NIL, the pitfalls that come from that, but also isn't necessarily anti-player, isn't just trying to take all the money back and isn't trying to, shortchange players by any means. He just understands that this is not a system that works for very much longer. Obviously understands money, obviously understands markets, and he's someone that I think could be very important to this. So there's a lot of different things to kind of come out from this. There's a lot of things that could never come out from this. The reality of this project is there are a lot of things that they're going to have to get over even to get to a point where they can enforce rules. So we're going to have to be a little bit patient here. But there are two things I can say with absolute confidence. I understand being skeptical of this. I totally get it. I totally get being skeptical of the people putting it together. I get all that. There's no argument there. You are more than welcome to those feelings. But the reality is there's two things I can say with absolute confidence. One, this gives us a shot. It gives us a shot to fix the sport that we all love the most. It gives us a shot to do some really, really incredible things. And I'll talk about the incredible hypothetical at the very end that could come from this. Number two is there's 1,000,001 pitfalls that they're going to have to get over to find a way to really put it all into action. So this is going to be very hard. That's the reality of the situation. And the biggest hurdle that you're going to find throughout this process is the antitrust exemption. It's something that has been a story in the NCAA. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about it vaguely throughout different news stories and, different court filings and things that have been going on in the sport recently. But the reality of the matter is that antitrust exemption is very necessary for college football right about now. We're in a position where we cannot apply any laws across the board or any rules across the board when it comes to NIL across the country because other states have different laws. So Georgia has a little bit more lenient NIL laws than, let's say, Illinois or some of the other states out there. So it's a battle. You have to find a way to be able to put rules across the board, across every single school in America, while still not going against the state laws. And that is impossible to do right now. It just genuinely is. A number of people have tried to do it. There have been a number of antitrust lawsuits. A number of people have made quite a bit of money from the antitrust lawsuits that have gone on the last little bit. You have to get over that hurdle. If you're going to get anything, at least anything genuine done from this group, you have to get over that hurdle. It's going to be a hard hurdle to get over because the reality is if you don't, this could be a huge nothing burger. It could just be a couple of guys in a room every week just talking about things that have already been talked about and bringing up things that have already been brought up, and it could be a mess. I'm not arguing that by any means, but I do think there are a lot of different things that can come from this. And I think if you get that antitrust exemption, let's just say they find a way to get that done. If they get that done, a lot of things can happen right after that. A lot of different rules can be put into place to make sure that kids are, doing things by the book, make sure that they don't get crazy huge benefits for not doing anything, to make sure that NIL is not being used as a recruiting chip, at least in terms of kids that are already in school or already playing for another team. Another team can't come in and swoop in and offer them money because they'll get punished for that. All of those things are just genuinely impossible for the NCAA to do right now. They don't have the power, they don't have the governmental power to do it, and they don't have the antitrust exemption to do it. You have to find a way to get that. This is a step in that right direction. I know the MLB has an exemption that has helped them out a lot and made it a lot easier for them to all work under kind of at least the same rules, the same set of rules, and that's something college football needs very badly. The other part of this that could be just incredible for the sport in so many different ways, and something that we'll talk about here in a second because there's a little bit of outrage around this, is if we get into the Sports Broadcasting Act of 1961, which won't get into details of how that works, but the reality is, if they were able to kind of make that a reality and make that something that could be enforceable in the college football world, that would mean college football could pull together and be one media deal. It wouldn't be the SEC is with ESPN and the Big Ten is with Fox and CBS and the Big 12 is with Fox and ESPN from time to time. That's not a reality anymore. At least if they can get this into the fray and get this to be a part of college football, it would be everyone. It would be every team in the FBS or maybe every team in the Power 5, depending on the way that they looked at it. But every team would have the same media deal. You would play around with it from week to week. It wouldn't be if you're an Ohio State team and you're playing an elite game on week 1 or week 2, you're going to be at noon because that's where Fox's slot is. Or if you're an SEC team and you're playing an elite game, you're going to be at 7:30 because that's where ESPN's best slot is. That's no longer the reality. That would not be the reality any longer. You would have the ability to say, Ohio State's playing Texas, we'll put that one at night. And then Syracuse, Tennessee, you can go to Fox. And Fox, you can broadcast that game at noon. Or Alabama, Florida State, CBS, congratulations, you get that one at 3:30. Whatever it is, the reality is you wouldn't have these really stringent media deals. You would have a media deal for all of the teams in college football, for all the teams in the Power 5, for what have you, but you would have everyone getting the same amount of resources from that media deal, and you wouldn't get caught up in all the craziness that does come with a lot of the ridiculousness that comes with that. But it would be a huge thing. And I think the other part of this is who's going to join those two guys. And that is a big, big piece of this, whether it's going to be Kirk Herbstreit or I know my guy Josh Pate is pushing for a spot, would be more than fine with him being on there. Whether it's, some players, I think that's a must for this commission. If you do not have actual athletes on that commission, whether it's current or former athletes, you're doing it wrong, plain and simple. No one understands this. No one is affected by this more than the players. You have to make sure they're in those rooms. So that's something that I definitely want to see who is going to be in that room. And then can we take this down? Can we take down the powers that be with Fox and ESPN and CBS and all these people being able to, I don't want to say ruin college football Saturdays because they do a great job broadcasting these games, but to kind of keep teams in boxes when it comes to media rights deals. So the reality of this is it is a huge step in the right, I don't want to say huge. It is a step in the right direction. It is absolutely a step in the right direction. It gives us an opening to have comprehensive rules, have a collective college football vision that doesn't just favor the SEC and the Big Ten, which I think all of us would be in favor on. Possibly rolling back a little of this realignment and getting back to some of the roots of college football. A little bit further down the road, of course, but definitely could be on the table. And then the biggest thing, college football could have one media contract and we couldn't get caught up in all of this craziness with Fox having to play the biggest game at noon, ESPN having to play the biggest game at night, every team only getting one good slot per day. We would have all the ability to play around with this a lot, play around with which games go which places, which networks get which times. It would be incredible, and it would be a very, very huge shakeup, so don't necessarily hold your breath by any means on a lot of this stuff, but that's the reality. It is a chance. It is a door open that we still got to walk through. We still got to walk through a number of pitfalls, a number of booby traps to get to the other side, but if we can get the antitrust exemption, if they can find a way to get comprehensive rules in place, if they can find a way to get rid of the media deals that take over this sport and make it a little bit upsetting at times, we have a chance to have a beautiful sport again, and one that has NIL, one that has revenue sharing, one that players make millions of dollars, but it doesn't feel like the main part of the conversation. It doesn't feel like every offseason we're talking way more about the guy that got $8 million from some college more than what's going to happen with the offensive line at Oklahoma. That's what I want to be talking about. That's what I want to get into. But the reality is a lot of it has been caught up with what's happening off the field. If this works, it could be an incredible, incredible thing that is the turning point in college sports going forward. If it doesn't work, then they could just be a lot of guys sitting in a room talking about things that they don't really need to be talking about. So it could be a very interesting thing to watch. There's no doubt about that, and we'll see how quickly all of this unfolds. I think there's quite a few hurdles to get over, so I wouldn't hold your breath too much, but there's a chance, and a very good chance to make really genuine difference in the sport. But a couple other headlines from around the sport real quickly. The Week 1 games that have been released in terms of their times is interesting by the very least. I know that top one is making a lot of people mad. Texas at Ohio State will be that noon kickoff. Something that we talked about just a second ago, that wouldn't be the case, at least in a college football media format. Fox would probably still get the game, but they would be able to broadcast it at night because they wouldn't have to worry about ESPN getting mad at them. They would have already worked that out. So that's something to think about. Definitely another thing, but disappointed, not surprised by any means that this game is at noon. I fully expected it. That's what's going to happen, and we'll see what happens. Still going to be an incredible game, but a little bit left on the chip there. But then you have Syracuse, Tennessee running kind of with that one in. Very different implications in this one than there were a month ago. Two new starting quarterbacks at both those places. Joey Aguilar at Tennessee, probably Steve Angeli over there at Syracuse. It'll be really interesting to watch what happens in this one. This one not in Knoxville, which is not ideal, but still will be a very fun game. Will be very interesting to see. You also have Alabama at Florida State, a game at 3:30 p.m., going to be awesome. There's no doubt about that. It's a very, very interesting one. If Bama loses, a lot of things go wrong in Tuscaloosa very quickly. I can promise you that. And then if Florida State loses, I don't think the sky is falling. I think people are looking at Mike Norvell very, very closely over the next week, and he better go on a little bit of run if they get beat, especially if they get blown out in that game. Then you have what I like to consider the creme de la creme of this upcoming season, LSU at Clemson. I cannot design a game that's much better than this one. It is an elite game, elite atmosphere, two elite teams at an elite time. It's perfect in every single way. Cannot wait for that one to get underway. Two Tigers. LSU has found a way to lose a lot of Week 1 games in the last little bit, so we'll see if they can get over that. And then one that made me mad as can be, South Carolina at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg at 3 p.m. on a Sunday. What are we doing here? Lane Stadium is one of the very best atmospheres in the entire country. You have a South Carolina team coming in with Lenora Sellers. I get moving it to Sunday. That's whatever. I understand that's part of the business in Week 1. How is this not a night game? How are you not allowing those students all the time in the world to hydrate? Let's just say hydrate for the time being, and they get out there and have an incredible Sunday night. You're giving them a Sunday 3 p.m. It's just ridiculous. It will not help with ratings with the NFL going, or this will be Week 1, excuse me. But regardless, it is not the greatest time for this thing to unfold. Lane Stadium at 3 p.m. on a Sunday just does not hit nearly as much as any other time at Lane Stadium, if I'm being totally honest. So don't love that by any means, but we got kickoff times, which means we're about to be able to smell football, and that's a beautiful time to be alive. Cam Rising has retired from football, another big-time thing that has happened over this past weekend. He is someone that will have a confusing legacy. I think for a lot of people, they'll remember the last 2 seasons where things didn't go his way. A lot of injuries, a lot of things that just got in the way, and it just looked really bad for Utah at different times. He was kind of a running joke for a little bit over the last little bit, but I need people to fully appreciate who he was and what he was to Utah for a number of years. He commits to Texas, goes to Texas for a year, transfers over to Utah, has a couple of injuries, has the COVID year, has a lot of eligibility, I guess is the best way to put it. Still had a piece of eligibility going into this year, which is incredible to say. But win back-to-back Pac-12 titles, including a win over Caleb Williams, where I think both those quarterbacks were about to get taken off in a stretcher. Both those guys battled so hard in that game, but Cam Rising comes out with the win. An incredible player. One of those guys that every single time Utah had a big game, you got the best out of Cam Rising. And he's an incredible player. Now he's going to go on to coach his old team, Newberry Park High School over there in California. Fun little fact, Brady Smeagol, the Michigan commit, very talented four-star quarterback. He's the quarterback there right now. So it'll be very fun to see what he can do at the high school level in terms of coaching. And I think this is a guy that you could hear about coaching in college football here pretty soon. Very smart guy, very smart football mind, and definitely someone I want to see around the sport for a very long time to come. And then finally, Jackson Cantwell, the number 1 overall recruit, has committed to Miami, committed yesterday. Mario Cristobal, just a massive pickup. The offensive line recruiting that he has been able to do has been downright incredible. This one might be the cream of the crop. This might be the best one that he has been able to pull in. And it sounded like it was a big-time NIL battle, and Miami won that by quite a bit. So a huge pickup for them, but regardless of the NIL part of this, Francis Mauanoa, incredible player. Samson Okunlola, absolutely going to be awesome. And then Jackson Cantwell, 3 guys that I think can just be incredible players for this offensive line for the next 4 or 5 years at the very least. So it's going to be incredible to watch what this kid can do. He will start as a freshman if I had to imagine. Too long, too athletic, just an incredible player. And Francis Mauanoa probably walking out the door after this year to the NFL. Jackson Cantwell could step right in and be their offensive tackle at a drop of a hat. So this is an absolute star. He's going to be in college for 3 years. He will be a top 10 overall pick. As long as injuries don't derail anything, he'll be an incredible player for a very long time. So a huge pickup for Miami. Definitely one that I think Georgia felt really good about going into the last couple of days. And then Miami found a way to swoop in and steal an SEC-type guy on the offensive line. They've been doing a great job of that on the O-line and the D-line. But Mario Cristobal continues to build it right down there in Coral Gables with quite a bit of help from his collective down there. But at the end of the day, whatever works is whatever works in this world. But an incredible kind of week of news, really. So many different things happening around college football, but that sports commission is going to be a huge one. It's going to be one that everyone's following very closely, one that could change the sport for the better in so many different ways. Also one that could be an absolute dud and be totally nothing for this sport. But we'll find out. I'm definitely crossing my fingers that they can figure something out. Nick Saban, Cody Campbell, and whoever ends up joining them. But let's take our last break and get into something a little bit more fun after this break. I did my post-spring top 10 last week. Want to get into 11 to 25 this week. We'll roll through it relatively quickly, but really hard list to put together. Feel pretty good about it, at least as of right now. But we'll break it down right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about a lot of different things that have happened over this past week, mainly that NCAA Sports Commission that has been set up by President Trump, will be co-chaired by Nick Saban and Cody Campbell. Will be a very interesting thing to watch. There's no doubt about that. And then a couple other things that have happened throughout the week, including Jackson Cantwell making his way down to Coral Gables, a huge pickup at offensive tackle for the Miami Hurricanes. But let's get into my post-spring top 25. I got into my top 10 last week, thought about just releasing a blog with the entirety of it, but wanted to get into it just a little bit on the show. So thought I'd break it down. We'll roll through this relatively quickly just so we don't drag too long here, but just a reminder of where my top 10 is. I do have Penn State setting the pace. I think that's the safest team right now. I think adding guys like Trevor Pena and Amari Campbell in the spring portal cycle was huge for them. I think this team has everything going for them, and not necessarily a title or bust year. You got to make big-time steps forward, though. I can tell you that, and it'll be a very interesting year up there in State College, but I got Penn State as my number 1 team. Texas right behind them. Have to feel good about what they have, especially on the defensive side of the ball. Cannot say enough about what Colin Simmons and Anthony Hill and all those guys can do. The offensive line is the one place that we'll have a question, and we'll actually probably get into that in next week's show, probably get into some more specifics, get into the SEC, get into the Big Ten, talk about questions around those conferences. We'll talk about that in a little bit after this segment, but something to think about. Texas here at 2, love that team. A couple of little questions, but the talent level is obviously off the charts. Clemson here at number 3, incredible team, absolutely one that just has just about everything. There's not really a weak spot on that team, at least not a glaring one, and I think Gideon Davidson coming in as the freshman running back is going to have to be huge, but K. Klubnik with that trio of wide receivers. You have TJ Parker, Peter Woods, Avian Terrell, all of those guys on the defensive side of the ball. They're going to be more than fine. Ohio State here at 4. Maybe a little bit high for some people. Fully understand that. They have the 2 best players in the country, as far as I'm concerned, in Caleb Downs and Jeremiah Smith. For some reason, forgot his last name there, but remarkable Ohio State team. I worry about the defensive line. That's the one area where I look at it now and say, not quite to the level that Ohio State usually is, but as of right now, an elite team, as long as Julian Sayin hits the way that they're talking about him right now, they'll be more than fine. Georgia at 5, again, one that could be a little bit high for some people. Kirby Smart's going to put a good team out there. I can almost promise you that. If they can get that offensive line downhill, if they can get that run game going, especially adding a guy like Josh McCray from Illinois in the spring portal cycle, they're going to be more than fine. And I think Gunnar Stockton's one of those guys that will shock a couple of people this upcoming season. Notre Dame, it sounds like CJ Carr will be taking over the quarterback duties there, but the reality is the run game and the defense that make me so excited. The back end of that defense is about as talented as you're going to find across the country. So many. Leonard Moore back there, an incredible guy going into his sophomore year that was already really, really good his freshman year. I think Jordan Clark's an incredible player, obviously. And then you have a young quarterback, you have a duo of running backs with Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price that are going to be downright elite. LSU, love this LSU team. One of the teams that I buy into just about every year, and I'll do it once again this year. Garrett Nussmeier going into his 5th year at LSU, his 2nd year as the starter. You have Caden Durham, one of the more underrated running backs in the entire country, in my opinion. A wide receiver group that was much rebuilt throughout the portal, but an incredible, incredible group of guys. And the defense, just one more year of Blake Baker, have to feel really confident in what they have. Oregon, a team that I worry about a little bit in some different areas. I think the additions they have on the offensive line are very talented. They're also coming up from lower levels of college football. Will they be able to handle the energy, the intensity, the physicality of a Big Ten schedule? That will be something we'll have to watch very closely. Alabama, a team that I have some questions about kind of the behind the scenes, but love the wide receiver group they have, love the back end that they have. I think getting back Deontay Lawson was huge to that linebacker group that is a little bit closer to that Alabama linebacking core that we've been used to. A remarkable team, and a team that I think when you have Kalen DeBoer comfortable into going into his 2nd year, you're going to see some special things from Tuscaloosa. And then Arizona State rounds out my top 10, a team that's returning the 2nd most production of any team in the country. Really, really talented guys all over the place. The run game is the worry, but with Kyson Brown and Kanye Udo, I think they're going to be more than fine, replacing a guy like Cam Scadaboo. And then Jordan Tyson is just one of the best, maybe the very best wide receiver in the entire country. So that's my top 10. That's where we're sitting right now. But let's take this 5 at a time and go through the rest of these. And we'll start with 11 through 15. Illinois barely misses my top 10, a very, very good team. Luke Altmaier is back, got a little bit of a offer from Tennessee, but decided to stick up there for Illinois. And Aiden Malafry, will be the running back down there, especially with Josh McCray moving on. Very talented kid, absolutely will be a huge piece for them. They have defenders that I think are going to make huge leaps going into their 2nd or 3rd year in the defense. And then the reality is, when Burt Belima tells me to believe in something, I'm going to believe in it. That's the reality. I think he's building something incredible over there, and I think the Illini is going to be a really fun team to watch. Maybe kind of that Indiana of this year. Obviously a little bit more over the radar than Indiana was coming into the year, but at the end of the day, love this Illinois team. Cannot wait to see what they can do and possibly make a little bit of a CFP run. Miami here at 12, definitely a team that is a big time question mark, but Carson Beck is plenty good to win you games and win you a lot of games. Get you a ACC title, get to the CFP. The defense has to help him out. He is not going to save you the same way Cam Ward did. The defense needs to take a leap. I really trust the talent that they have, especially on the back end over there. But the reality of the matter is, Corey Heatherman's got to get in there, get everything in order. If he can, could be a really fun team and definitely a team that could win the ACC and maybe make a little bit more of a run in the CFP. Then you got Florida, a team that I understand being them being at 13 after what happened last year is a little bit crazy. It's a very good team. This is a team that has all the talent in the world. They have the quarterback that I tend to think is going to be one of the top 5 quarterbacks in the entire country this year. They have a wide receiver group that I think is about as good as you're going to find around the country. Adding Dallas Wilson at the very last minute in the recruiting class was huge. I think they have so much going for them going into this season, and I just think when you have a quarterback like that, you cannot bet against a team like that. So I love the Florida Gators. I think they're a team that last year, if you really look back at it and watch every single game they played, that's a good football team that just came up short in a couple of games. So I really like what Florida has. I think they're going to be really dangerous, and DJ Lagway has a lot to do with that. I'll be totally honest. Then you got Kansas State. It feels like everyone has just forgotten about Kansas State. Now, you will see them in a lot of top 25 polls, but Avery Johnson going into his second year as a starter, adding Lincoln Kerr, who's going to be one of the better tight ends in the entire country almost right away. And then Dylan Edwards, getting the most out of him at the running back position is going to be huge, especially with DJ Giddens moving on. I think Dylan Edwards could be one of the most special players in the entire Big 12, especially on the offensive side of the ball. Really like what this Kansas State team can do, and I think they're going to take a step forward after, I don't want to say a down year, but a year that left a little bit on the table, definitely for the Wildcats. And then rounding out my top 15, Texas A&M. An A&M team, Marcel Reed with a better wide receiver core, Le'Veon Moss actually healthy, which you saw a very considerable drop-off for how that team played when Le'Veon Moss was in the game, when he was not. It was a very different team. So that is a huge thing to get back from them. I think the defense returns quite a bit. They're 6th in returning production in the entire country. This is a team that has everything in front of them. There's no doubt about that. The defense should be getting better under Mike Elko, and they have every chance to make another CFP run. They also have every chance to possibly be another 8-4 season and be as frustrated as they were at the end of last year, this year as well. But really like what A&M has, and I think that top-level talent is just downright elite. 16 through 20 starts with Iowa State. Love what Iowa State is doing right about now. I think this is a team that has a lot going for them. And I understand losing Jaden Higgins, losing Jalen Noel is a very, very nervous thing, but you still have Abu Sama and Carson Hansen in that backfield. I think the addition of Chase Sewell from ECU is downright huge. Xavier Townsend coming over from UCF is another one that I absolutely love. And I think when you really get down to it, Rocco Becht is one of the better quarterbacks you're going to find in the entire country. Not just in the Big 12, might be the best quarterback in the Big 12, but I want to go back on that. There are a couple of different guys that I could put in that position, but Rocco Becht is very, very talented. A lot of different things going for this Iowa State team, and I trust Matt Campbell. There's no doubt about that. I think it's going to be a really fun team that very well could be one of those teams in the CFP. Ole Miss here at 17. I can't put them higher than this because I just don't know. I don't know what team they're going to have. I don't know how the transfer portal guys are going to work out. I love Austin Simmons. I think the talent level is incredible. I think he has a little bit more zip than Jackson Dart did. I think he'll be able to handle some of those RPO looks that Jackson Dart didn't necessarily struggle with at times, but at times wouldn't necessarily be as crisp. I think Austin Simmons can do that, but you're replacing a lot. That's just the reality. Caden Lee coming back is huge as the big-time wide receiver, but quite a few guys that you're going to have to replace. It'll be a battle for South Carolina. There's no doubt about that. Moving down, for Ole Miss. Now we'll move down to South Carolina 18. Lenore Sellers is a very real Heisman contender. There's no doubt about that. There's quite a bit of turnover on that defense. Now, they have Dylan Stewart, so that solves a lot of the issues that they're going to have. There's no doubt about that. But losing Kyle Kennard, losing Nick Eamon Ward, losing Demetrius Knight, all those guys are huge, and they're all at 3 different parts of the defense. So it's going to be a battle. They're still trying to figure out if Rashul Faison is going to be able to go, the transfer running back that they were able to get from any number of schools at this point. Can't remember where he was last, but an incredible player nonetheless, and absolutely a guy that will make a lot of plays, I believe out of Utah State, if I'm not mistaken. But an incredible player. Will he be able to play is the big-time question around there in Columbia. And then you move on to 19, Oklahoma. Oklahoma, to me, has the most ability to jump up here. They also have quite an ability to move down, if I'm being totally honest with you. John Mateer is a special player, plain and simple. He's one of the top 5 quarterbacks in the entire country. He is going to make that offensive line look a whole lot better than they did last year, plain and simple. Regardless if they play better than they played last year or not, they will look better because that quarterback is just that special. Now, if the offensive line can get 30% better, 40% better, they could be a really tough offense to slow down. You add Jay Knott right next to him in that backfield. You have wide receivers like Deion Burks coming back to that team. It could be a really fun Oklahoma team. Now, obviously, that offensive line and defensive line, really, I still have big time questions about, but the reality is that takes a moderate step forward. You could have a really special offense that could be very, very hard to stop. And then you got Indiana here at 20. Fernando Mendoza enters why am I blanking on his name? Where Curtis Rourke kind of left off. Remarkable talent, getting a lot of eyes from the NFL scouts. So I think from a talent level, he will be better than Curtis Rourke. Will he be able to play in those close games? Will he be able to play kind of even the way Curtis Rourke was able to throughout the season? That's going to be a big time battle. I really like what this team does. A lot of new transfers coming in, and that'll be another question mark for them. But you got to love Kurt Zignetti. You got to love Fernando Mendoza. And I think this team is going to be more than fine. Maybe not a CFP team, but definitely a team in the conversation in the Big Ten going into this year. And then we'll round it out, and we'll start with the Auburn Tigers here at 21. Another team, kind of like Florida, that has all the talent in the world. If you look back at last year, they were a top 25 or 20 offense and defense, total offense and total defense. They went 7-5, and it's just because they turned the ball over every single game in every single important part. The other reality is you have a quarterback coming in that likes to turn the ball over. Jackson Arnold made quite a few mistakes, and some of that had to do with his offensive line that should be infinitely better this year at Auburn than it was at Oklahoma last year. But the reality is you have to get over that hump, especially because you won't have Jarquez Hunter right next to him. You won't have that security blanket that you can hand off to, and he will give you 5 yards, keep the drive going. You will have a run game. There's no doubt about that. But the offensive line is going to have to pick up some slack. I'm sure Jackson Arnold will be involved in that in some way. It'll be a very interesting team, but the talent level is downright elite. Adding Eric Singleton, I think Jackson Arnold is a big-time upgrade from the quarterback position they've had last year. I think they got a really good team, and I think they're one of those teams that maybe you're not thinking about right now from the SEC, but they could explode onto the scene pretty quickly. Georgia Tech, here at number 2, a team that a lot of people are talking about. A lot of people are getting into, a lot of people are watching very closely, and I fully understand why. Haynes King coming back is downright huge. You also have a guy in Aaron Philo sitting on the bench that can win you plenty of games. I can promise you that. And then Jamal Haynes in that backfield as well. Malik Rutherford, Eric Rivers on the outside. It's about as good as you're going to find around the ACC. I think it's a really, really good group, and I think it's a team that, in terms of culture, you're not going to find a more solid one around the country. Incredible, incredible group. Brent Key has his guys ready to roll every single game, and it's a team that's very used to playing a top 10 toughest schedule. They're kind of right wedged in there with the SEC teams. They're all the way down at number 48 this year. So they avoid a lot of those teams like the Louisvilles that we'll talk about here in a second, or like, I don't think they avoid Syracuse, but they avoid quite a few teams. They avoid Miami in the ACC this year, so this could be a very dangerous Georgia Tech team, maybe just a CFP team if they get things right. And then Louisville right behind them, a team that I absolutely love. And I'm getting really, really in love with at least the idea of Louisville. Not quite in love with Louisville yet, but adding Miller Moss, I think he fits Jeff Brom perfectly. I think he's someone that can do incredible things in that offense. The run game with Isaac Brown and just about every other freshman running back they had last year is going to be really, really fun to watch as they progress. I really like this team, and I think that defense is just always going to be dangerous. You are losing Ashton Gillette, and that's going to be huge, but a remarkable team, and Jeff Brom always has those guys ready to roll. So really like this Louisville team, and I think Miller Moss is one of the bigger portal acquisitions that no one's really talking about. Sawyer Robertson is maybe the best quarterback in the country that no one's talking about. An incredible, incredible player. He might be the best quarterback in the Big 12. I said Rocco Becht earlier. I might lean Sawyer Robertson's direction. But regardless, remarkable quarterback. The duo of Pendergrass as well in Washington, elite running back duo that they're going to be able to build with. And then Dave Aranda's defense just keeps making strides every single year, every single week of last year. Just kept taking that little step forward. I think it's going to take a rather big step forward this year, and I think they could be a team that could find themselves smack dab in the middle of that Big 12 conversation. And then Texas Tech here at 10. It's a team that, or here at 25, excuse me. It's a team that I am having a really hard time not falling in love with. Baron Morton is tons of fun. Really like what he brings to this offense at quarterback. The talent around him on the outside is going to be plenty fine. Probably about as elite as you're going to find around the Big 12, except for maybe Colorado at that wide receiver position. And then you got guys on the offensive and defensive line that just don't really look like everyone else in the conference. They look a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger, a little bit faster, and Cody Campbell has a lot to do with that, like we just talked about. But the reality is, this is a Texas Tech team that I really like. I snuck them in here to the top 25 because I think they could do some really special things. But a couple of teams are missing from here, and let's talk about those teams real quick. SMU might be the most glaring one that is not on here. I think losing Brashard Smith is a bigger deal than people think, and I think losing some of those D linemen that they lost is absolutely huge. I just don't necessarily, I'm not smitten with this SMU team, at least yet. We'll see what happens. Still very much love Kevin Jennings and what they can do, but I could see a little bit of a falling back down to earth for SMU going into 2025. Iowa, I just can't do it. I'll just be totally honest. I can't do it. Love Mark Gronowski. Think it's going to be a really fun team, but can't put them in my top 25 with the offense that they have. Michigan, love the idea of this team. I can't back a freshman quarterback, at least until I've seen him play. We'll see what happens. Maybe they'll vault all the way up into the top 15 after that first game, but we'll see what happens there. And then BYU was missing off here. It's just something I can't trust them to do again. I don't necessarily love the team. I don't think they're quite as talented as some of the other teams in the Big 12, and I think they got quite a bit of luck to find their way where they were last year. I just don't see it happening again, even though they're a very talented team and they returned quite a few guys, including Jake Retzlaff as their quarterback. I just can't buy into it. I don't know why. I just don't necessarily love BYU going into this year. But that'll do it for this edition of Just Another College Football Podcast. Went a little bit longer than I was hoping to, but quite a bit to talk about. And we'll get into even more next week. We'll probably start getting into some SEC Big Ten breakdowns after spring, get into some big-time questions as you head into fall camp, a lot of different things. Maybe we'll do SEC one day, Big Ten one day, and then keep moving on down the line. We'll get into all of that as we get on over the next couple of weeks. But thank you once again for listening. Please subscribe, please comment, please like, please do all of the things. Even if you're commenting that you don't like the show, I'll take what I can get at this point. So please do comment, please like, please subscribe to the show, and I'll be back next week. We'll start doing a lot more content, maybe some individual videos going out here pretty soon, but as of right now, we'll just we'll be back here the same time on Wednesday, and I will talk to you then. Thank you so much for listening.